So now let's move on to Matplotlib. And it's a library for creating plots, graphs, bar graphs, line charts, and so on. But before we do that, we have to create a plot area. And we do that using the figure object. So let's import Matplotlib and run this cell. And let's create our figure object. So I'm going to set fig to plc.figure. And let's run that. And you see we created a figure object, but it doesn't have any axes. So now let's add an axis. So first let me add the axis and then I'll explain what it's doing. .add underscore axis. And it takes our rect argument. And that takes 4 elements. Or we need to put it as a list. So let's run it. And you see we created our figure. So what axis does is that it takes the rect argument. And the third and fourth element is the width and the height. And by default, the width is 6.4 and the height is 4.8. These first two arguments deals with the left and the bottom. We'll only need to change this if we want to add more than one axis. So if we want to cut this into half, we can put 0.5 here. And we'll also cut the width in half from the default. And let's run that. And you see we get smaller. We can establish our own height and width. And we do that with the fig size argument. So again, I'll just copy this, paste it here. And in the figure arguments, you just have to write fig size. And I want to set it to 5 by 5. And then it will return a height of 2.5 and a width of 2.5 because 0.5 times 5 is 2.5. And let's run that. Or we should surround this by brackets. Now let's run that. And you see we got our 2.5 by 2.5. We can assign axis to a variable. So let me just copy this, paste it here. And let's create a variable called axes and set that equals to, and I'm just going to copy this, Control C, paste it, and let's run that. Oh, we need to put fig. Calling our fig variable that we created here to add the axis onto it. And let's run that. And you see we got the same figure that we got up here. So now let's add 2 axes. So I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and call this one axis 2. And let's run that. And we have 2 axes, but we can't see it because it's overlapping each other. So if we want to bring axis 2 to the right, we need to put a 1 in our right argument. So let's run that. And you see we got 2 axes in our figure object. Let me change this to 1. Let me make the axis bigger. And let's run that. And you see it's too close to each other because of how big it is. If we want to create some space from the right, we just give this a 1.5. Now let's run that. And you see we created some space. Now let's add labels and titles. So I'm just going to go here. And we'll add titles to both axes. So I'm going to call in our first axis, I'm going to use the set title. And I'm going to call it chart 1 or chart uno. Then let me just copy this, paste it. We want axis, set the title to axis 2. I'm going to call it chart dos. And now let's run that. And you see we added titles to our axes. So let me put title here. And now I want to give labels to our X and Y. So labels. So I'm going to call in the first axis dot set X label. Should be an underscore between set X label. And I'm going to put our X for chart uno. And then I'm just going to copy this. Control V. Change this Y. And then I'm going to change this to our Y for chart uno. Then I'm gonna copy both of these because I just don't want to type over and over again. And then I'm gonna set axis to 2. And then I'm gonna write X label for chart dos. Then I'm gonna say Y label for chart dos. Now let's run that. And you see we created our X and Y labels and also put titles in our chart. If we want to remove this, we can write this plt.show. Whoa. And let's run that. And you see it was removed. But there's an easier way to create multiple charts. So let's move on to subplots. And subplots is more convenient than using the figure method. So let me create subplots. And then I'm going to give it 1 row and 1 column. So what this means, that is going to give us 1 plot, 1 row and 1 column. Let's say if we want 1 row and 2 columns, so it's going to give 2 charts side by side. We put 2 in the column argument, and you see it gives us our subplots. We can do 2 by 2. We can also do 3 by 3 if we want, so on. But you see it's all jumbled up too close to each other. So we can fix this with the type layout argument. Type layout, and we set that equals to true. And let's run that. And you see we got some space. So now let's make labels and titles for subplots. I'm just gonna do 2 because it'll be a while to create labels for all of these. So 2 by 2. And then we want 2 axes. So the way how we do this, figure, and then we're gonna add our axes in between brackets. So x1, x2, and I'm gonna set that equals to PLT subplots. Let's run that. And you see we got our 2 by 2. Let me give 1 row and 2 columns instead. And you see we have 1 row and 2 columns. So let's add labels and titles for the first axis. So I'm gonna call in up the first axis. So axis 1 dot set underscore title, and I'm gonna say our first, and then I'm gonna set the Y label, then I'm gonna call that height, gonna set the X label, call that age, so let me run that. And you see we labeled we didn't get the X label because I made a mistake here. I'm supposed to put X label here. Let's run that. And you see we got the age. So now let's set the labels and titles for the second axis. So let me copy this, paste it here. For the second axis. Then I'm gonna change this to x2. Call this our second. I'm just gonna call these cars, mile. And let's run that. And you see we did the labeling and titling for our second axis. We can also change the size of this by adding the fig size method. So fig size equals, I'm gonna give it 12 by 8. Let's run that. And you see we gave our figure a bigger size. Let me give it 8x4 to see what it looks like. And that's a little better. If we want to change the font size, we could do this with the font dict argument. Set that equals to a dictionary font size. And we want to give it size of 20. I'm just going to copy this. Paste this here. And I'm going to do the same for here. And just set these to 15. And now let's run that. And you see our changes has been made. In the next lesson, we'll go over how to create a bar plot. So now let's move on to bar plots in Matplotlib. But before we create a bar plot, we have to make some changes to our data frame. So here we imported Matplotlib as PLT and pandas as PD, and we loaded our CSV into a data frame. And we were bringing up the top 5 rows in our data frame. Here we renamed the country column to country, and we set the in place is true so that the changes remain in our data frame. And then we created a new data frame, and we only wanted the region column and the population column. And you see we have it here. And then we grouped by our region column, and we want the sum of the populations that we grouped by the region column. And you see we got this data frame. And next we reset the index, because here the region column is the index. And then when we use the reset index function, region and column becomes its own columns. So before we create a bar plot, we have to create a figure object. So we set fig equals to, set the fig size to 5x5. Let's run that. And you see we created our plot area. Now let's add our axis. And we're gonna set this as 1, 1 because we want the plot size to be 5x5. If I set this to 0.5, it will be half of the figure size. Now let's set our X label. If you're not sure of what I'm doing here, just refer to the previous lesson, and we explained figures, axes, and subplots. So I want to call the label region. I'm going to call that total population. And then I'm going to set a title. Axis.set underscore title. Region. And now let's run that. And you see we created our plot area. I'm gonna take this down a little bit. Give this 0.2 or 0.6. Now that's a little smaller. And give it 0.4. Now let's go at 0.6. So I'll set it to 0.7. So now let's plot our bars. So here's set a note. Plotting the bars. So we call the matplotlib function plt.bar. And in between brackets, we call our data frame and the region column for the X and the population column for the and let's run that. And you see we plotted our bars. If we want to remove this, we can add plt.show as the last line here. and you see it was removed. If we want to change the colors to our bar plot, we just add the color argument and let's change it to red. And let's run that. And you see our bar plot's been changed to red. We can add a list of colors for each bar. So we put it in a list. And the first one I want to be red. The second one be blue. The third one be purple. And the fourth one could be white. Let's run that. And you see we changed our colors. Let me just erase this because it doesn't look nice. I'll run that. We can sort this in descending order by just sorting the population in descending order in our data frame. So call data frame 2 dot our sort values function. And we want to sort it by the population column. And then we set the ascending to false, because by default it's in this ascending order, and we change the in place to true. In place equals true. And let's run that. Oh, I spelled ascending wrong. So let's run that. And let me run this cell again. And you see it sorted the bars in this ascending order. So now let's create a horizontal bar chart next to this. And I'm gonna do this using subplots. So we're gonna set our figure, and we put our, I wanna make 2 bar plots. So one axis and axis 2. And I'm gonna set that to plt.subplots. And the arguments it takes is we want 1 row and 2 columns of axes, and then we want the fig size to be, let's set it to 10 by 5. And let's set the tight layout to true. If you don't understand what I'm saying here, just refer to the previous lesson. And let's run this. Oh, I spelled subplots wrong. So put a P here and let's run it. And you see we got our plots. Now let's set labels and titles for the first axis. And I think I'm just gonna copy from this one here. Let me copy this, Control C. Control V to paste. And I'm gonna rename this as AX1. And then I'm gonna set the labels and titles for the second axis. So let me just copy this, paste it here. For the second axis, I'm gonna change this to axis 2. And then I'm gonna make some changes here. I want the Y label to be country, the X label to be population, and I want the title to be total population by country. Let me run this. And you see we created our plot area and gave it labels and titles. So now let's plot our bar. So I'm gonna call our axis dot bar. We're gonna put the same thing here, Control C. Paste it in here. And I'm gonna set this to bar 1 and give our notes for bar 2. I'm gonna call our second axis. And I'm gonna make this second one horizontal. So let me set bar H. And in the brackets, we want the country column in our data frame and the population. And the reason why I put this bar H is because I want it horizontal. So let's run that. Oh, the reason why we're getting this mistake is because I'm calling the data frame 2. I'm calling a column from the data frame 2 that doesn't exist. So this is data frame 2. But I'll call my data frame. So let me just erase this 2. So we call out our data frame. And let's run that. And you see we got both our plots. And you see we got a horizontal bar plots because we used the bar H function for axis 2. So this is how to create bar plots in Matplotlib. So now let's move on to line plots in Matplotlib. So before I create a line plot, I manipulated the data to how I want it to be. So first I imported all the libraries I'm gonna need to do that. And here I imported our CSV file into a data frame. And we dropped a column named unnamed column too. And then we changed the data type of the day column to a datetime data type. And I sort the values by day. And then I took the year out of the day column and put it into its own column. And then we only put the 2 columns into our data frame. Then here you see we get the 2 columns. And then we grouped it by the year. And we set the aggregate to the sum. So we grouped it by year and the sum of the bicycle hires. So now let's create our line plot. So first we have to create figures and axes. Fig equal to plt.figure. And then we're gonna set the fig size to, let's do 6x3. And create our ax, set that to fig.add underscore axes. And we only want 1. So we set the up and down to 0. And we want the 6x3 size. So we set these to 1. And let's run that. Oh, first I need to run, we didn't run this cell. So let me run all the cells. And you see we got our figure. So now let's add a plot. So we call our ax.plot. And then we want the year column for the x and the number of bicycle hires for the y. Let me just go copy this. Control C. Paste it here. Now let's run that. And you see we got our line. We can set a marker. Marker equals to, and let's just give it a dot. So we put it up O. Let's run that. And we get a marker. To change the color is the same way we did with the bar plot in the previous lesson. So I mean, set color equals to, let's say purple. Run that, and you see we did it. If we want, we could plot another axis on this same figure. So let me copy this and just make some changes to it. So what I'm gonna do is just multiply all of this times 2. And let's run that. And you see we got our second plot. Let me give it a color of red. And you see we changed the color of the second plot. If we want to set titles and labels, ax1.set underscore title. And I'm just going to put number of hires. Then set the X label. Set that to year. Let's get the Y label. Set that to number of hires. And let's add the plt.show function to remove this. And let's run it. And you see we change our title and axis. So that's how you make a line plot in Matplotlib. So now let's move on to scatter plots in Matplotlib. And before we create any scatter plots, let me just go through the data preparation. So we imported pandas as PD and Matplotlib as. Then we stored our players.csv file into our data frame. And here you see our players data frame. But by default, pandas doesn't show all the columns in a data frame if it's too much. So in order to display all the columns, we need to use the pandas set option. And in between brackets, we put the display max columns and none as the arguments. And then now you see all the columns is displayed. So now we take the top 100 players from the data frame and we put it in a new variable called df. So what we're going to do is create a scatter plot, and we're going to plot the players overall and their wage. So let's first create our figure. So I'm going to set fig to equal to plt.figure. And we're going to set the fig size to, let's say, 6x4. And next what we have to do is add axis to our figure object. So we're gonna create a variable ax1 and set that equals to fig.add_axes, and in between brackets we put 0, 0, 1, 1. The last two ones, it means the length and the width. So since we put 1 here, our fig size will be 6x4. If we had put 0.5 here, then and 0.5 here also, then our figure size would be 3x2. So let me run that. Oh, PLT is not defined. I need to run this cell. So let me just run all cells. Let me make this a little smaller. Too small. Yeah, and that's okay. So now let's add labels and titles. Set titles. I'm gonna call it overall ability versus wages. I'm gonna set our X label, overall ability, and set our Y label, set that to wages, and let's run that. And you see we set our labels, and now let's create our scatter plot. So I'm gonna call in our axis.scatter, and then we said we wanted the overall column and the wage column. Overall, let me make sure I'm then the wage dot, and let's run that. And you see we made our scatter plot. If you want to remove this, you could type plt.show. We could change the size with the S argument. Let's set that to equal to 20. See what happens. And you see it got smaller. 50. Another way we could do this, let me just copy this, paste it here. And then we call on the data arguments and we set that equals to our data frame. So let me comment that out. And this will just do the same thing. Let's run that. Oh, we need to put a comma here. Let's run that. And you see it does the same thing. But the good thing about this is, let's say we only want to get the top 10 players in our data frame. We could just put data frame dot head, and in between brackets we put 10. So let's run that. And you see we only plotted for the top 10 players in our data frame. So this is scatter plots. So now let's move on to histograms in Matplotlib. And a histogram can show us frequency distribution. It is a graph showing the number of occurrences of a value within given intervals or bin. So here we imported our necessary libraries, and then we put our players CSV into a data frame. And then we use this pandas set option so we can view all the columns. And what we're gonna make our histogram on is the overall column. So let's do that. Let's first create our figure. And set the fig size to equals 5 by 5. Now let's create our axis. So I'll name it ax1 equals fig dot add underscore axes. And we put in 0 and 0 in the first two arguments because we only want one figure. And then we're going to use 1 and 1 because we want the fig size to be 5 by 5. Now let's plot our histogram. So use the histogram, and in between brackets, we put our overall column in the player's data frame. Now let's run that. The name of our data frame is players. Let's run that. And to remove these, I'll just add plt.show. And you see we created our histogram. We can add xticks to align with the bins. So we're gonna create our own bins here. But first let's create the xticks, plt.xticks. And we want it by 25. So I'm gonna do 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100. And then we need to use the bin arguments and use the same xticks values. So bins equals 0, 25, 50, 75, 100. And now let's run that. And you see we created our bins and aligned it. And you see we created our xticks and we aligned it with the bins. If we want a horizontal histogram, let's press Ctrl+C here, paste it here, and all we have to do is add the horizontal argument. No, not the, we use the orientation argument. And then we set that to horizontal. Let's run that. Oh, we have to put white ticks here. And let's run that. And you see it fixed the x-axis. We can also add an edge color argument. And we could set that to red. And you see we get a red outline over the histogram bars. So this is how you create histograms in Matplotlib. If you want to know how to add X and Y labels, you can refer to the previous video. Now let's move on to box plots in Matplotlib. And a box plot is a data distribution that is represented by boxes and whiskers. It takes a numerical array or arrays, and from that array it displays the mean along with the first quartile and the third quartile, and the whiskers extend up to 1.5 times the upper quartile and lower quartile. So here I imported the necessary libraries and I put our CSV file into a data frame, and we're only going to do the overall column. So before we create our box plot, let's create the figure. I'm gonna set fig to plt.figure. I'm gonna set the fig size to 5 by 5. And then we're gonna create our axis and set that equal to fig.add axis. And we're gonna put 0 and 0 for the first two arguments since we're only dealing with one figure. And we're gonna set the last two to 1 because we want the fig size to be 5 by 5. And then let's create our box plot. Box plot. And we want the overall column in the player's data frame. Let's put plt.show because we only want the box plot. Oh, we need to put an equal sign. Let's run that. And you see we got our box plot. And we see this line represents the mean. This one represents the upper quartile. And the whiskers is 1.5 times the upper quartile. This is the lower quartile, and the whiskers, that's 1.5 times the lower quartile. And these little round things is the outliers. If we want to remove it, we set the show flyers argument to false. And let's run that. And you see the outliers was removed. And by default, it will be numbered. But if we want to put our own label, we just set the label argument to equals overall score. And let's run that. Oh, it's labels with an S. And you see we labeled our box plot. We can put two box plots on one figure, but first let's do some preparation for that. So I only want the inter players, and to get them, we call the players data frame. There's a column in our data frame called club name, and we're gonna set that equals to inter, and then we want the overall. Let me copy this, and for here we want Dortmund, and we set that to, in the club name column it's named Now let's create another variable and set that equals to Inter and Dortmund. Let's run that. Oh, this doesn't need a equals. Let's run this cell. And it's the player's data frame, not player. We keep getting mistakes. Club name. Oh, the club, it has an underscore. The name of the column, club name, is club underscore name. And now everything is fine. So let's create a box plot comparing the two different teams. I'm just going to copy this here. And then I'm going to set ax.boxplot. And in between the bracket, I'm going to put data. Then I'm going to write plt.show. Let's run that. And you see we fit both of our box plots inside of the figure. If we want to change the default 1 and 2, we can set the labels to label equals Inter Milan. Let's run that. Let's see what's the problem. Oh, it's labels. Let's run that. And you see we changed the default labels. Now let's quickly just move into Violin plots. And let's create our Violin plots. We're going to use the same figure and axis. And then we're going to put the ax dot calling our Violin plot keyword. And let's put the data that we created up here. Let me add plc.show. Run that. And you see we created our violin plots. If we want to add our box plot in the same axis with the violin plot, we just call this line right here, Control C, put it here, and let's run that. And you see we put our box plot and violin plots in the same axis.